Fill your garden with colour with Thompson and Morgan's young plants. Easy to grow, they're delivered direct to your door at just the right time for planting. And there are no post and packing charges. To find out more, write or telephone for a free plants catalogue and visit our secure website. You'll find the details printed on the cover of your video.
This is where it all starts. From these small, healthy seedlings, we get all this. Wasn't that fantastic? And the owners of that garden grew all those plants from either seed or cuttings. And growing plants from seed is one of the easiest ways to grow large quantities of plants. So that's where I'm going to start. And the first job is to fill a container ready for sowing. A full seed tray would produce far too many seedlings for most people. So the alternatives are half a seed tray like that, which would produce about 500 seedlings, which is still rather a lot. Then you go down to a quarter seed tray, and you can even get a strip like that. But my favourite is a small half pot this size, which will produce about 40 seedlings, which I think is just about enough for most people. Now for the compost. It's very important to choose a seed or cuttings compost which contains just enough food, not too much, to get your seedlings off to a really good start. Don't choose potting compost because that will contain too much and will be too rich for your seedlings. Now overfill the pot with compost like that, then just knock the surface off level. Then put it onto a flat surface and just tap it onto the decks like that to sort out any bumps or hollows that are in the pot. Then take another pot with a reasonably flat surface on the bottom and press it down all over the level like that. So you end up with a surface that's just about a centimetre below the rim and that's nice and level to sow your seeds on. At this stage, if you think ahead, it's a good idea to water the container using a fine rose on a watering can and leave it to drain for about half an hour. But if, like me, you're always in a rush, then it's okay to sow on a dry surface, but you must remember to water carefully once you've finished. Now for the seed sowing. Well, seed comes in all shapes and sizes, from these large, easy to sow French beans to these tiny, dust-like begonia seeds. They are so small. Now they're so small that they are extremely difficult to sow. So the way to do it is to get a carrier such as silver sand like this. You just want a small quantity of it, about 5 times as much as the seed that you're going to sow. And then tip the seed into it. And then mix it round in the silver sand. Give it a good old mix. And then you can sow it directly onto the surface of the compost, spreading it out evenly all over. And then you've got a really good chance of the tiny seed being spaced out. Now this seed is so small that it doesn't need covering, but what it does need is a good watering. And because I didn't soak this compost beforehand, what I'm going to do is just place the pot into a saucer of water. The pot will soak that up from the bottom. It'll take about 15 minutes, and then after that period of time you'll notice that the surface is glistening and the pot feels heavy, and that means it's had enough water. But to make our lives easier, tiny seeds like this can now be bought in a pelleted form like that. And they've just been covered with a clay coating which makes them easier to handle. Though you must remember to water them thoroughly after you've sown them so the water can actually get through the clay coating and it doesn't act as a barrier. Now everyone has their own favourite method of seed sowing. You can either, once you've tipped the seed out into the palm of your hand, just fold your hand up and let the seed just drop out through the crease of your palm like that. I actually find that way a little bit difficult. Another way is to just take a pinch of seeds and drop them from a height above the compost, and that way they bounce as they land and they bounce apart so they don't all land in one clump. Alternatively, and I find this way the easiest, is to put the seeds into a seed packet that's been folded in half and then just lightly tap them at the bottom, and that way they all just bounce out one by one. And try to aim for them landing about 1 centimetre apart, and sow on the thin side. If ever in doubt, sow thinner rather than thickly, because you'll only get problems when seedlings are sown too thick. That's about right there. So now ready for the covering. Once again, everybody has their own favourite way of covering seeds. You can either use a kitchen sieve like this filled with compost and just tap it on the side, so you get a nice fine covering coming out, and you want to put on a layer that's just thick enough so you can't see the seed anymore. And once they've completely disappeared, then that's plenty for them. Just wipe the surface off like that. Now, one thing with using compost is that it can sometimes cap on the surface, and a cap is really just a layer that packs tight that the seedlings can't push up through. That can sometimes be a bit of a problem, and a way to get round that is to use a covering like vermiculite. And this, again, you just put a thin layer on top of the compost like that. And this material, it won't cap. And also, if your seeds by any chance need light to germinate, then light can get through this covering of vermiculite. Then finally, don't forget to label it. And I'm going to put the label in on the side like that there, so I can put a sheet of glass over the top, but you could use cling film instead, and this helps just to keep a nice humid atmosphere inside. And seeing as this hasn't been watered before, I'm going to put it into a tray of water like that and leave it for about 15 minutes to soak it up. Then it needs to go onto a nice warm spot for the seeds to germinate. After about 10 days to 2 weeks, this is the sort of thing you should be looking at. Nice and thinly spaced, not too crowded, quite even germination. Next to it in that tray is far too crowded. There's far too many seedlings there and they'll just grow tall and spindly. Next to that, there's one that's been sown too thinly and it's very, very patchy. And next to that, well, the last one, that was probably sown okay in the right quantities, but because it was watered over the top with a rose on a watering can, all the seeds have washed to one side. Of course, other complications do happen sometimes, and the problem with this seed tray is damping off disease, which is a fungal disease. Now, this can be prevented by watering the seedlings with a fungicide at a very young stage, but it's also exaggerated by heavy-handed watering. So go easy watering young seedlings and only give them a water when the seedling has just started to dry out. But when your seedlings are at this stage, then they're ready to be pricked out. Now, pricking out is really just transferring the seedlings into another container to give them a bit more room. Now, to use this, you just need a dibber, it's called, but it's something just to hoik them out a bit like that. And just take out a clump out of the surface of the compost, lay them down, and it's very important to hold the seedlings by their seed leaves. Now, on these petunias, they both look rather similar, but the seed leaves here have a slightly different texture. They're slightly shiny and they're smaller and fatter than the true leaves, which are these ones here. So you always hold them by their seed leaves, never by the stem. Okay, a seedling only has one stem for the whole of its life, but it can grow more leaves. And then you just mark out little holes ready for them on the seed tray. And I'm going to put 5 by 8. So put the holes along like that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then holding the seedling like so, you just pop it into the hole and just firm the compost around it. You carry on like that until you've filled up the seed tray. And as I said, there should be 40 in here. And then you give them a good watering in. These seedlings were pricked out a few days ago, whereas these larger ones were done about 4 weeks ago. Now they'll soon be ready for hardening off outside, either in a cold frame or put outside during the day and brought in during the night. And this basically just toughens them up before they're planted outside for the summer. As well as buying seed, you can also collect it from your garden. And not just annual flowers, but longer lived ones like roses. Last autumn, Brad and I went off in search of rose hips. This is like my own personal lottery because any one of the seeds in these hips could turn out to be a real winner. I must admit the chances are about the same as winning a big prize on the real lottery, but it's lots of fun and it costs virtually nothing, although I will have to wait a few years to get the result. What do you reckon, Brad?
Well, what odds will you give me? I mean, if you look inside one of these, you're getting probably about 25 seeds.
Yeah, still a million to one.
All right, it just means you've got to collect a lot more hips. I think a few years ago, what I'd probably done with these is drop them down your back, you know, make you itch.
Yeah, come on, I can think of a better use to put to them.
All right then, come on. We'll make ourselves millionaires, shall we? Well, we're not quite millionaires yet, but we're well on the way.
Well, we might be soon. What have you got in your trug?
Those seeds we collected when we were up in St Albans, look.
Yes.
Look at this, in here.
You've been stratifying them.
That's right, I've been stratifying them. Keep them in wet sand for a year. And in here we have hips and, if I give one a squeeze look, the rose seed.
Why do roses need stratification?
Well, they have what is called a chemical dormancy, and that needs to be overcome by periods of warm and cold. And because it's had a summer and a winter, you get chemical changes in the seed. It'll germinate about a year from now. And you never know, maybe one of these will be the one that makes us the fortune.
So where have you been keeping them? Just in a corner of the garden?
Just a corner of the garden, north facing really, nice and shady. I check them about once a month for water, but of course through the winter they've not really needed that much attention. I've also got some other bits that I've been collecting. I've been quite busy since we last met. We've got some sweet pea seed here.
They're always really good value, aren't they, to collect your own?
Well, I reckon they're brilliant. They're one of my favourite flowers. But I mean, look at this. See how it's twisted?
Wonderful. And they just ping themselves
out. That's right, yeah.
Out,
they really catapult off, don't they? The interesting thing with the seeds on these, and you can see there's another one just tucked in there, they have a hard seed coat, and that's the problem, getting them to germinate. You actually need to break through that hard seed coat. And I always think it's a little bit of a dangerous occupation when you actually pin them down and then scrape a little bit of the seed coat
fingers,
away.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I tend to do is use a bit of emery board and then just rub away a small part of the seed on those. But it's a good way of, particularly with the perennial sweet peas, collecting your own and keeping them going from one year to the next.
Of course, you can soak them overnight as well, can't you?
You can, and that makes the chipping away of the seed coat easier. But I tend to just do them dry and just be very careful with your finger ends. I collected some poppy seeds, look. See these? Can you hear it? I think there's one or two in there, but not many. Those remind me of baby's rattles, those. But inside, if you look in here, I fold in the bag. Just look at this lot.
Thousands.
Yep,
of them.
thousands and thousands. And I collected these slightly early because I wanted to say in where they actually went in the garden rather than scattering everywhere. You don't want to mess about with stratifying your own seed or collecting your own seed. There's a way around it. They come through the post and they've already started to germinate. This is called chitted seed. And I've got 1 or 2 little bits that I want to grow here. This is Acer palmatum, one of the Japanese maples, look.
Can I have a look inside one of those?
Well, you've got to be careful, but we'll give it a try, because the roots are a bit delicate. Right, here it comes. There you go.
Wonderful. Look at those lovely long
Are they alive
roots.
enough for you?
Oh, great. Because
Yeah,
they're very tricky. They need a lot of heat to germinate, don't they?
Well, yeah, and somebody's done all the hard work for you, you know. You just take them on to the next stage.
Better get sowing.
It's that time of year.
Not all plants will come true from seed, so you have to look at other methods of propagation. The leaves, the stems, and even the roots can be used to increase your stock. It's called vegetative propagation. Let's start with the stems. Now, these are classified according to age. First of all, at the beginning of the year, there's the softwood cuttings, which is the soft young growth. Then later in the year, as the base of the stem starts to mature, but the top is still soft, these are classed as semi-ripe cuttings. Then finally, at the end of the year, as plants become dormant, the stems become woody, and these are hardwood cuttings. So, softwood cuttings. Now, two of the most popular plants to propagate this way are fuchsias and pelargoniums. And who better to show us how than David Clark?
To take fuchsia cuttings, just snip them off. One. I'll take, I think, 3 here for demonstration purposes. 2 and 3. You see, I've taken them in between a node. That is, I haven't trimmed them to just below a leaf joint. But I do find it's helpful to use hormone rooting powder. Just dip them in and plant them in compost. Now, it's got to be compost which is suitable for seed sowing or cuttings. Don't use potting compost because it's too strong and it could even inhibit the formation of roots. You can either put them in trays like this or, as I prefer, in individual pots. Again, dip it in hormone rooting powder, tap off any excess and plant them. Right. Now, these need to be contained in an enclosed space to prevent them from drying out too much and to keep the atmosphere moist. A large polythene bag will do, but by far the best thing is a heated propagator. Now, if you don't keep it in a nice humid atmosphere, the cutting will wilt too much. You see that one there? That has wilted and it probably won't root now. And here is a cutting which was taken 8 weeks ago and showing a lot of growth, and you can see the leaves are now quite firm. I'm going to take some pelargonium cuttings now, starting off with a zonal pelargonium. Some people will still call these geraniums. First of all, after selecting a nice strong shoot, I'm going to take the cutting just above a leaf node. There we are. Now, if you cut below a leaf node, you're going to leave a nasty little snag on the plant, and this very often rots. Now it's a matter of cleaning up the cutting before planting it. So it's necessary to remove the lower leaves and these little pieces at the side, which are called stipules. They should be removed, and of course any flower buds. And that's about the right amount of leafage. Possibly some growers might like to take that one off as well. And I'll take these top stipules off. The only thing remaining now is to trim it just below a leaf node. The reason for that is that the natural hormones in the cutting that produce the roots are concentrated at the node. So if you cut just below, you stand the best chance of getting that cutting to root. There. Now it's ready for planting. Notice with this one I'm not going to use hormone rooting powder. Now the problem is that if you use hormone rooting powder for zonal and ivy leaf pelargoniums, the base of the cutting tends to swell and crack, and when you get them rooted, they'll root very well, pop them on, they suddenly rot. This is hormone rooting powder. Don't use it for zonal pelargoniums or ivy leaf pelargoniums. Now, this is a regal pelargonium. They take longer to root than other pelargonium cuttings, so I'm going to use hormone rooting powder. They really do need it, particularly in the winter period. They probably won't root without hormone rooting powder. Unlike fuchsia cuttings, these don't need to be kept in a close atmosphere. If you do that, they will rot. You can just leave them in a lightly shaded greenhouse, preferably at a temperature of about 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 15 to 18 degrees Celsius. If you use a propagator, make sure that the little ventilator holes in it are open. They do need buoyant atmosphere if they're going to root properly. I've got here some cuttings which are 8 weeks old, and you can see they do develop quite quickly.
Gardeners usually refer to the leaf joints as the nodes, and cuttings are normally made just below a node, like that, and they're called nodal cuttings. But some cuttings, like clematis, are made from internodal cuttings, which basically means cutting them off in between the nodes, like that. And that's at the bottom, and then I just cut this bit off at the top like that, and then that is the cutting.
Now I'm going to take some Christmas cactus cuttings. Surprisingly enough, these are still stem cuttings. They don't have any leaves. In fact, the stems have become flattened so that they fulfill the purpose of normal stems and leaves at the same time. The technical term for these is they are a cladode. Right, I'm going to take a couple of cuttings. Here's a nice one with 1, 2, 3 segments. Chop it off low down. That's one. And now, here we are, here's another one here. Just 1, 2, 3 segments. Chop it off. There we are. 2 cuttings. Move that out the way. Dip them into hormone rooting powder straight away, like so. And we don't plant them now. We leave them for a full fortnight at least, so that the ends of the cuttings dry up. This is common with all cacti. All cactus cuttings of all types should be treated in roughly the same way. I've got a couple of cuttings here that have been standing around in the greenhouse on the bench for 2 to 3 weeks. You can see they're a little flabby, but they will root very quickly and they stand very little chance of rotting. I like to put 2 in each pot, rather back to back. The reason for that is that they make a much more balanced plant.
These chrysanthemums were lifted from the garden in the autumn and kept in a frost-free place over the winter. In early spring they were given a little bit of heat, and now they've produced all these lovely young shoots all ready to take cuttings from. All herbaceous plants, including chrysanthemums and dahlias, produce these lovely young shoots from the base, and in horticultural terms they're described as basal cuttings, and they're very easy to take. This is how you do it. Now, an ordinary potting compost mixed half and half with something like perlite will make a nice free draining open compost. And that looks about right, like that. So it's just a matter of filling up a pot with compost, and then just knock the pot off like that. Give it a couple of taps on the table to knock out any air pockets. And then you're ready to take your cutting. Sharp knife. Now, take the cutting right down at the very base and cut it off as close to the base as you possibly can. Like that. That looks good. Put the box to one side. Now place the cutting onto a hard surface so you can make a clean cut, and cut it just below a node. Nice clean cut like that, and then it's a matter of removing some of these lower leaves to clear about 2 centimetres of stem at the bottom, so that's just about right. And then you're ready to insert that into the compost. Just make a hole with your finger, place the cutting in and lightly firm it around the stem like that, then you're ready to take the next one. Then once you've filled up the pot, give it a really thorough watering. Now it shouldn't need watering again until the cuttings have rooted, but if they start to look a little bit limp, then you can give them a light spraying over with water. Now this pot needs to be treated exactly the same as any other softwood cuttings by putting them in a warm, humid environment. Well, these cuttings were taken a few weeks ago and it looks like they're growing away nicely, which means that they must have roots. So let's have a look. Tip them out of the pot. Ah, yes, lovely. So now the cuttings are ready to move into individual pots. So that was softwood cuttings, but later in the year it'll be time for semi-ripe cuttings.
Autumn's the ideal time of year for propagating plants from semi-ripe cuttings. Prepare the cuttings by removing the lower leaves. Dip the base of each cutting in rooting powder and then insert them into an open, free-draining compost. Give the cuttings plenty of room because they could well be in here for about 6 months. You can propagate a whole range of plants like this, but mainly the broad-leaved evergreens, things like Elaeagnus and Senecio and holly. You can also do Mahonia, but this is slightly different. With Mahonias, you can actually take 2 buds, there's one there, one here, a single leaf. You get this small log or section of stem. These are often referred to as log or mallet cuttings. Once all the cuttings have been inserted, give them all a thorough watering, really drench them, and then close down the lid of the frame. Doesn't matter whether it's glass or plastic. And now you've created a damp, cool rooting environment, and many of these plants actually root better when they root slowly in a cold or cool environment. Now, you don't necessarily need to have sophisticated and purpose-built propagation facilities, as you can see back there. Here we've got a simple water bottle with the bottom cut off. It's just a plastic version of the old-fashioned bell jar. Few cuttings in the border. Place the bell jar over, push it into the ground. If it gets too warm, you can ventilate by opening the cap on the top, and that'll do just as good a job.
When the plants shut down for the winter and the stems become dormant, then it's the ideal time to take hardwood cuttings.
You know, propagating hardwood cuttings couldn't be simpler. You go for the current season's growth, and as soon as the leaves have fallen, you just take sections off. You start by making a basal cut just below a node or leaf joint. I use my secateurs as a rough guide so that I know that I'm getting the cuttings all around about the right length. Then the top cut is a slanting cut up towards the bud. The only reason you do that is it makes it heal up a little bit better. A useful tip with hardwood cuttings, rather than make a trench, you push your fork into the ground, rock it so that you open some holes out, and then you just push a cutting down each of the holes you've made. Firm them with your boot. Then just tidy up afterwards. Takes no time at all.
Some plants can be propagated from just using a single leaf, and the Streptocarpus or Cape Primrose is one of those. Now, the first thing to do is to fill up a seed tray with seed or cuttings compost and leave it, water it, and then leave it to drain. Then you're ready to select a leaf. It's very important to choose a healthy leaf because the plant that develops is going to be exactly the same as the parent. Cut it off with a sharp knife. Now, when you've got a nice leaf, lay it down on a firm surface, upside down, and then you need to cut out the midrib. Again, using an extremely sharp knife, or if you haven't got one, then a razor blade is a good idea. Cut out the midrib, The midrib is really just an extension of the leaf stalk. And when you've got the leaf in two halves like that, it's exposed all the lateral veins along the edge, and that's where all the plantlets develop. So, then you take your compost and just make a groove using something like a ruler into the compost, and then lay your leaves in lengthways, just burying them slightly and pressing them into the surface, like so. And then give it a good watering in and put it in a warm, humid environment in a propagator, and shortly plantlets will develop along the leaf edge. In fact, in about 2 months, this is what you'll get. All along the length, young plantlets will have developed. Here there's about 20. And if I take these out, these are just about ready for potting on now. They're large enough to handle. And it's just a matter of separating out the little individual plantlets, like that, with their individual roots, and potting them on into separate pots. A slightly different method is to use just the tip of the leaf or sections of the leaf that are about 5 centimetres thick. Now this of course will produce less plants, but then the leaf goes further. And after 2 growing seasons, this is the sort of result you can expect.
The part of the plant that people often forget about is the roots, which is a shame really, because there are quite a few plants can be propagated from root cuttings. Think of it as cuttings from the underworld. We'll take this one out of the pot and see what we've got to deal with. Start by squeezing the compost to break up the root ball. Do this gently, and then it's ready for washing. You need to wash all of the compost from the roots. And although we're going to cut up the roots, we don't want to damage them too much at this stage. We're starting to find something. Look, the roots are gradually emerging. It's a bit of a slow process, but it will pay dividends in terms of the number of cuttings we'll get without doing too much damage. Just let it drain off a bit. We've got it cleaned up. We can see what we're dealing with. The roots that we want are these thick, fleshy ones. The thin fibre we don't really want at all. We can get perfectly good cuttings from these. Go around cutting them off. You want them about 2 inches long if you can get them that size. Work your way around the plant, tease them out gently, and then cut them off. If you find any pieces of root that are damaged or bruised or look a bit off colour, a bit like that, when you actually prepare the cuttings they can be discarded. You can get away with something as thin as that. But oh, look at that, that's ideal. Just look at the thickness on that. Sort out the cuttings, clean them off, then cut them into lengths of around about 2 inches long. If you're not sure which is the top and bottom, don't worry about it. Put them in the pot horizontally. I prefer that anyway, because you get a plant coming from either end, so you actually get more plants for your money. Once you've filled the pot with cuttings, I like to cover them over with sand. Once this is damp, it'll stop the cuttings drying out, which is the main cause for death on root cuttings. Just enough sand to cover them nicely. Give it a tap so that the sand settles. If you can see the cuttings rising through it, put a little bit more on until the cuttings are completely buried. There we go. And I'm going to put this in a cold frame and give it a good water. The cuttings will go in the frame, they'll be there over winter, and then next spring they'll get small shoots develop on either end of the root section, and that's where you get the new plants from. This is an oriental poppy. There's a whole range of plants that you can propagate from root cuttings, and it ranges from herbaceous plants like phlox through to, well, really vigorous climbers like wisteria. You can take that from root cuttings just as easily.
To keep herbaceous plants happy and healthy, they have to be lifted and divided every few years, and that can be done either now in the spring or in the autumn.
Many plants have a clump forming habit. The gardeners can exploit this growth pattern and use it as a method of propagation. You can actually split up plants. This is called division. You start by selecting the plant that you want, carefully lifting it with a fork, and because most division tends to be done in the autumn and winter, quite often you'll want to take the plant inside under cover. It's much more convenient to work there. A useful tip when you've lifted plants for dividing them, I always think it pays dividends if you actually wash as much soil away from the roots of the plant as you can. There are several reasons for that. For a start, you can actually see what you're doing, and if there are any weed roots or anything in there, you can differentiate between those and the plant that you want to propagate. But also, when you're dividing plants up, you may well need to use a knife or secateurs, and of course the less soil there is there, the less wear and tear you're going to get on the equipment that you're using to help you with the division. Even when the weather's quite bad, there are still plenty of gardening jobs that you can do, especially if you find a spot under cover. It's pretty foul outside, but I've got a bit of shelter here. I'll just hang my coat up, it's soaking through, and get rid of the hat. What I've got here, herbaceous geranium. Now there are actually lots of plants here, and it can be divided up. You can pot the pieces and then plant them again in the spring. And the way it's done is you actually tease plants apart, just a little bit of pressure. You don't need to rip and tear, and start to divide the clump up, and you'll be amazed just how many plants you can get from something like this. Various things to look for. The old dark woody pieces, they're not much use, they won't regenerate. You want the young paler roots and these bright coloured crowns, sections of stem with the leaves coming from them. And stack them off to one side, out of the way. Get a pair of old secateurs as you're cutting into soil, and just cut those out. Check the leaves, leave them about 6 inches long. The bit that you're after is this new growth here. It doesn't matter about that old bit there. A small amount of that gives anchorage, but that's the piece you want. That will provide you with the new plant. Just look at the number of plants that we've got. All that's from one clump that we divided up. The next stage is to pot them on. All you need to do, didn't trim that well enough, I'll take a bit more off it. Finger in the pot, nice loose compost. Push a piece of geranium in. It's relatively easy. The thing to watch for is if you put this in too deep, you bury the crown, the growing point of the plant, and quite often it will rot off. So make sure you don't do that. Sooner put them in slightly high rather than too deep. It's just a case of potting now until they're all finished. Now, the herbaceous plants, they're perfectly hardy, so you don't need to worry about giving them protection through the winter. They'll stay in a cold frame without any cover over it. There's no problem there, and they're ready for planting again any time in the spring, so that when you've redesigned your herbaceous border you can just drop them in wherever you want. You may want to give them a water, but really at this time of year it's only to settle the compost rather than them actually needing water to carry on growing.
This This is rather interesting because where two branches of this magnolia tree have rubbed together, they've naturally grafted and are growing as one branch. But purposefully grafting plants together can open up a whole new world of possibilities, as Mike Honor explains.
Now, grafting, a lot of mystique about grafting, and most people will be very frightened to do it, but I can show you a way where most people, anyone that sort of can use their hands, can make a graft. And I'm going to talk about grafting rhododendrons. Now, grafting is joining two components together, the scion and a stock, a root stock. Now, the scion is the top part of the plant, and the one that's going to produce the lovely flowers, and the ones you want to grow for another plant. And that is this part of the plant. It's usually the current year's growth. And ideally without a flower bud. A flower bud, these fortunately have growth buds on them. Flower buds will be big fat ones. Avoid those. Go for growth buds where possible. So that's the scion. 1 year's growth. Ideally about a pencil thickness without a flower bud. Now the stock, now this is a seedling of the rhododendron ponticum. You know, the lovely mauve one. Well, lovely, it's a weed in some places, but it's the mauve, the common one. Now that makes a very good stock. It's nice and vigorous and makes a good stock. Now this is a seedling, been in a pot about a year, well established, and that's what we want. And ideally dry the root out a bit, and this is just about right, this one. So that's the stock, and this is the scion. We'll start with the scion. Now we're going to cut it off close to the plant there. It's not going to ruin the shape of the plant there, and I'll take all that off like that. Now that's the piece we're going to use as a scion. Now, I don't know if I told you, but a graft is joining the cambium layers together. Now to show you the cambium layer, I can cut this piece off of here because I've got plenty of length there, cut it off at an angle. And I can show you, I think I put my glasses on at this point and I can see it myself. Because it's quite small, the cambium layer. That's better. Now I can see it. It's at that little dark green line all the way there between the rind and the wood. It has to match the same on the stock. And that's where it will unite and make a good graft. Now we're working on the scion to begin with because this will give us the width of the cut we need to make on the stock. I've got too many leaves on there, so I'll take some of those off. We'll use the secateurs, that'll be probably safer. Just nip those off like that. Because the more leaves on there, the more moisture is going to be taken out of the scion. That's it, it will need that moisture to grow. So that's the scion, and we've got to think now of it going on the side of the stock. So this sort of bending away side, that's the side I want to present to the stock. Now a sloping cut. And be careful, if you've got a very sharp knife like this, move the knife with your hand. Don't start cutting on your thumb. Move the whole lot together like that. One sweep through. And the ideal length of that cut will be roughly 5 times in length to the diameter of the scion. So imagining again about that length, turn it over and cut on the other side what we call the basal cut like that, which is roughly 45-degree angle, that sort of thing. Now that is the scion. So imagine we've got to cut now the corresponding cuts on the stock for that to fit into. So while we're about it, we'll trap those leaves in an elastic band. It makes it much easier for the next operation. So put that aside there, where we can see it, to see the width of the cut there. Now again, we've got to think of where that where the scion is going onto the stock there, so as it's going to be away like that. And that's like looks an ideal side there. Try and keep it down as low as possible, because if you can imagine when this is a growing plant and we're planting it in the garden, we can probably bury that union and it will root on its own roots. Now make the basal cut first to correspond with the cut on the end of the scion, thinking of the same angle, and then matching beside it the stock, which is roughly about there, and cutting down into the basal cut like so. That piece flies out like that. Now that's the cut that the scion fits into. Now just to measure them up against there, that's just about right, I think. And they fit together nicely like that. Now the next thing is to tie it in. I've got the proper ties here. These are latex ties, what the commercial people use, the nurserymen use. But you can use anything like this, ordinary rubber band, just cut them, they're just as good. But this is the proper tie. Trap that end between your fingers and put a bit of tension on there, because this has got to be really secure. Trap that end and wind it down to the bottom, leaving a space between the ties like that, and finishing off with a half hitch on the bottom. Now that'll hold that secure, and the beauty of these latex ties is that they perish in time, so they're stretching with the stem stretching, and they'll perish and fall off eventually. Now elastic band off. I think what I'll do now is I'll take that top off. There's still plenty of growth on there to bring the sap up, and these buds here will grow and encourage more growth here. Any of those sort of diseased bits of leaf off like that, because that could spread. Because this has now got to go into an environment which is warm and moist for this to unite. And the easiest way for the amateur to do, and when you've only got one like this, is to use the old polythene bag. Just put it in like that. No need to water it yet. Wait for some time. Keep an eye on it to see if it's not getting too dry. And pull that up to the top like that. Make sure the leaves are in. And put an elastic band or a twist tie around there. And in about 3 weeks or so, something like that, you'll see between the ties a white callus forming where the two cambiums are uniting. And that's the time then to give it a little bit of ventilation. And if the bag is getting very, very wet, heavy with condensation, change the bag. That's the easiest way of doing it. And then gradually harden it off until you can let it stand on its own. And that callus then goes brown, shows that it's hardened. And it's hardened off nicely. And then you can give it more and more air like this. Do things gradually, don't sort of put it straight out in the open air. And then when you're very satisfied that that is a good union, and possibly the bud will be growing to tell you that, then is the time to cut it off there. So then this side can grow on with all the vigour of that root. So then that's the finished plant when you've cut it off there. So keep it in the bag like this and out of the sun. It doesn't want to get too hot, but in a nice warm glass, I'll say 65, something like that, 60, 65 degrees. And as I say, that's how you graft a rhododendron. Now, this is another easy graft you can do, very similar to the rhododendron graft, and this is grafting a birch. This is only just a 1 year seedling of the ordinary common birch. And this has been potted into a pot for about a year, roughly about a year now. And the important thing is, we've got to dry this root out. And it's got to be looks a bit damp because it's a peaty compost, but it is quite dry. It's important to keep it dry because once we cut it off, birch bleed very freely. It's almost like water pumps out of them. Now that's the stock. Now the scion is a piece we've collected from a lovely Himalayan birch, one of those lovely white barked ones that we're going to put on there to grow. Now these are the scions. They're not necessarily 1 year's growth. I mean, that one is 2 years growth, but they're just about the size we want. We want them roughly 9 inches long. Now that's going to work out right because we can just cut that above that bud there, leaving that nice growth bud on the top. Now that's the scion. Now it looks a bit drastic, but this is what we're going to do. We're going to cut this off around about inch and a half from the surface of the compost. There we go, like that. Now we've finished with that. I probably need to clean that up a bit. Now remember, I'm using a very sharp knife here, and I'm used to a knife, so anyone that's not used to a knife, be very careful. But that's all nice and trimmed up. I've cut all the bruised area which the secateurs made. Now you can imagine I'm going to, again, joining the cambium layers up as we did on the rhododendron, I'm going to graft that onto there. Can you see like that? It's going to be grafted onto that side. Now I'll start off with the sign to begin with. Same principle, a sloping cut, possibly longer than 5 times the diameter. Try and keep it as long as possible to get a good contact of cambium. So that's the sloping cut that side. Turn it over and do the basal cut there. Now that's the sign. Now we're going to cut the stock, and we're going to match that cut there. Basal cut first. Good idea to measure it now. Basal cut about there. Put that down. Make the basal cut in there. And with this one, it's better to cut down into the basal cut like that. So, and then up with the other one. And again, it's not desperate to make this all one cut, long as your cuts are nice and flat. Okay, now I reckon that one's just about right. See, I've got to match up the cambium layers again. You'll see a bit of green around these because the cambium layer on the stock is slightly into the sign. The rind is thicker on the stock, so that's the ideal. And that little basal cut holds that until we tie it. Now I'm going to tie it with a different material this time because it's quite a delicate little thing, so I'm using ordinary polythene. I've cut a strip off of a polythene bag. Same principle. Trap the end, turn it over like that, trap the end. Yeah, it's a bit thin perhaps. You can't put quite so much tension on this one, but wind it down the same as we did with the rhododendron, trapping the end like that and a nice half inch on the bottom. There, and pull that odd piece off like that. Now that's grafted a birch, and now it's nice and securely tied there, and all that remains now is to wax these areas over, just the cut area there at the top, and not forgetting the cut on the top, because this being a deciduous plant, we don't need to put it in a polythene bag. We can put it out on the glasshouse bench and wait for it to grow. And once these buds start pushing and getting a bit green, then we can start watering it. But remember, keep the stock nice and dry until the buds are actually pushing. Now to wax it over. Make sure you don't burn things there, but that's working quite well. And down the side. The thing is to stop a loss of moisture from those cut areas. That looks quite good, and don't forget the little one on the top there. Yes, there we are.
Air layering is one of the oldest methods of propagating plants. It's been used for thousands of years.
Layering. It's a form of what I call no-risk propagation. Here we've got an established vine and it's been air layered. And what we've done is the young shoot, as it's developed, has actually grown through one of the drainage holes in the bottom of the pot. As it's grown out through the top of the pot, this has been filled with compost. Hopefully it's formed roots, and so we should have a complete plant. What we need to do now is separate this from the parent plant and see just how much development's taken place. Cutting under there, cut the string, and here it's still holding in one spot. It's a bit awkward, but there we go. Now then, you can see there's actually 2 plants in there we might get, but you can see where the plants actually entered the base of the pot. Now what I'm trying to find out now is whether or not we've actually got any roots on this. And we've got mixed success here. One piece hasn't, and the other piece has got a few roots starting to form. Now, although you can't see it anymore, this section of stem was actually damaged in terms of it was cut. The cut, when it opened, had a stone forced in to stop it healing. That way you actually stimulate the formation of roots rather than just healing over the cut that was made. And there you've got a small plant that can be put somewhere else in the garden or potted up. Most plants are layered directly into the soil. An ideal branch is one like this, where it's growing along the ground. Start by pulling the branch out of the way, removing any debris. With a trowel, check to find the exact point that you want to get the roots to form. Chop out a hole. You need to go about 6 inches deep. Hold the branch over the hole to make sure you've got it exactly right. And then, to stimulate rooting, wound the underside of the branch. Once you've done that, I always use a wire peg, and this will hold the piece of plant in position. Just push the wire down so that it holds everything in place. Won't root if it keeps flapping about. And then start to push the soil back. Shake it gently so that the soil settles around the stem. In a year's time, you can separate this plant from the parent, and then you've doubled the number of plants that you've got.
Without a doubt, propagating plants is the most thrilling job in gardening, and to provide those warm, humid conditions we keep talking about, a propagator is what you need.
There you go, a propagator.
I like that. That is really ingenious. It's got a lot of height, hasn't it? So
Yep.
you can put cuttings in it, and you can control the humidity by taking the lid on and off.
Yep, it's semi-automatic.
I think it's great. Never mind
Right.
that.
Then you can
Well
go
done.
upmarket a bit.
Yeah.
You get something that's got electric element in it.
Yep.
It's a bit on the low side, but it does a good job. It will give you a lift of about 6 degrees C.
And you can control the humidity by these little vents
That's right.
that are on it. But so not that hot, really.
No,
Just
and
takes the edge off
very
things.
basic, but it does give you a start.
Yeah. Yep.
And then you start to move up again. You get something where you can adjust. You've got adjustable controls on the front. Still the same type of canopy with the ventilators. And
Yep.
this is always a good sign. Look at the condensation.
Oh yes,
See?
nice and humid in
Yep.
there. Well, I can do better than that,
Oh, yeah?
Brad. Just look at this. It's wonderful, state of the art. Now, this type of misting unit only used to be available to the professionals, but it's now on the amateur market. And it consists of this big hot plate here, which supplies bottom heat, and a spray nozzle at the top which supplies a fine mist over the plants, and it's controlled by this little element which is called
right.
a wet and dry leaf, which is
Oh.
controlled by those two boxes up there. Now when it dries out, it automatically sets off the misting units to keep the leaves wet again.
So can we see it work then?
Yeah, well, look closely and I'll switch it on.
Right in. It works.
Leave it to it then.
If you'd like information on the other titles in this video series, write or telephone for a free colour leaflet, or visit our secure website. You'll find the details printed on the cover of your video.